Welcome, I'm Hannah and this is the Theology Therapist channel. Last week on the video, we talked about belonging, moves and transitions, and how do you, what's the process that one goes through. And we ended with what happens when you aren't able to create a sense of belonging wherever you've landed. And so that's what I want to pick up with today. So if you haven't watched it, you can go back and watch it now. Otherwise, it will likely pop up on the screen at the end of this video. But I want to talk about loneliness. So I think loneliness is something that we all experience at some point or another, and it's quite debilitating in a lot of ways. I find that there can be two different types of loneliness. There's circumstantial loneliness, and then there is profound loneliness, right? So circumstantial loneliness would be you move, you go through a life or a role transition, like maybe divorce or end of a relationship, or like you change jobs, like just sort of various different types of roles or things in life that may cause some upheaval. The other thing that can happen is like, potentially our friends move away. So various things can cause this sort of, right, there's circumstances, there's surrounding circumstances. I would say death could be a circumstantial precipitant of loneliness. So we have moves, whether it's ours or our friends' moves, life and role transitions, jobs, right? Or death, an experience of loss, okay? And then we have what would be profound loneliness. And so profound loneliness is really something that it seems to not change despite the circumstances. Oftentimes they find this in folks with, maybe there's been some early childhood neglect, or if there's been any sort of abuse, if there's been trauma. Not to say that if somebody's experienced any of those things, like they're going to feel lonely no matter what all the time. No, but just that more often what happens is, in the case of feeling a sense of profound loneliness, it's neglect, abuse, trauma, or having absent parents. So circumstantial, profound, right? So there's that sort of deep-seated feeling of something missing or of like being alone in the world. Now, what would be the signs and symptoms of loneliness? Loneliness can look like crying for no reason. It can look like mood swings. It can look like irritability. Declining social invitations, ironically enough, we'll talk about that in a second, hyper-focusing on or overthinking social interactions, being critical of yourself among others. So that's like, I go hang out with somebody, or I go to the coffee shop and I have an interaction and I think, oh my God, I was so weird during that interaction at the coffee shop, right? And then I start to pick apart, right? In the beginning, I might think, oh no, it's no big deal. I see them, every Monday, and it's normal to have an off Monday. But then as the days go on, I may start to pick apart more and more that interaction, right? So that sort of maybe hyper-criticism specifically about ourselves in interaction in relation to other people. All right, and then there is like in the case of also circumstantial loneliness, but maybe to a lesser degree, there is a disbelief that, or a negative perspective about the possibility that things are going to change. And it's also a feeling like lack of hope, right? So I'll talk about this a little bit, specifically about my move from Boston. So when I left Boston, I left it at a time when I loved it. I did have a sense that my time there was kind of coming to a close, but not for reasons, right? Like I really was satisfied with my job. I had an incredible community of friends and an incredible religious community that I was part of. And so I left it at a time that I loved it. Then I moved, basically been back and forth between Europe and Texas, and it was for a number of years. And what happened was, it was actually really quite difficult to create a sort of community or a sense of belonging in both places, in Texas and in Europe. There's a reason why I left Texas, right? As a native Texan here, there was a reason why I left in both of those places. In Europe, where I've spent more time as opposed to Texas since then, since I left Boston, it has been quite hard to find a community. I think we can all agree, and I hear this from clients all the time, that it is significantly harder to make friends and to build a community as an adult. And so that's just a reality that exists. The thing about it is that it takes a lot of time, takes a lot of dedication and consistency. It's been really hard, you know? Even though I have made friends here, and I've made really sweet friends. And I probably say this often, and maybe too much. You can tell me, you can let me know. But I don't think that we quite realize how profoundly COVID and quarantine and the pandemic have impacted us. For myself, around the time that I had moved and left Boston, there was a pandemic and there was quarantining. And so whether the loneliness is about not finding my people, or is it actually just about having really great friends, but having this negative bias? So, right, that's the negative things are the things that stick. It's like Velcro. And having this negative bias that tells me, or that, you know, sort of points out to me all the ways in which I might feel alone, kind of exaggerates or brings to the forefront all the things that are the reasons why I might feel lonely, right? And I think that's important. It's important to remember how something that we've never lived through before, but something like quarantine on a grand scale, sheltering in place, right? That prevented us, that kept us from creating connection with people, creating a sense of belonging. And now as a therapist, I hear this all the time. People are feeling some level of anxiety a lot of times about going out and meeting people, whether that's due to risk precaution, whether that's due to sort of adaptation, right? Of kind of getting used to being at home and not being around people. That's an important point, right? We got used to being at home, not being around people, and yet longing for genuine connection with others. And yet, when we have the opportunity, what I'm hearing is that we may choose to not take it, or may choose to decline it, right? That is, in and of itself, that is what happens with loneliness. Or loneliness is essentially the need, the desire for genuine connection. But what it actually does is it creates isolation. What it actually does is it prevents us from reaching out and connecting with other people. There's this book, if you haven't read it, I recommend it. It's called Together by Vivek Murthy, and it talks about loneliness. It calls loneliness this is a quote, a public health concern and one of the leading causes of epidemics today, not pandemic, epidemics today. Alcohol and drug addiction, depression, anxiety. Vivek Murthy was the Surgeon General in the US for a number of years, and so he wrote this book. This was sort of his contribution after what he observed as the Surgeon General. And what he observed was the impact of loneliness as a public health concern. So he lists 3 safeguards against loneliness. Those are genuine connection, solitude, and service. So genuine connection, that's a given, right? What we need is to connect with others in a meaningful way. In order to do that, we need to give our undivided attention. So, that's eye contact, it's appropriate touch, it's being in the room, right? Now, solitude, you might be like, what? That's the opposite. But actually, and he shows this in his research, but I find this in a lot of time in myself and in my work as a therapist, that we are able to much better engage in a much more centered or grounded way when we have a deep connection to ourselves. So solitude, what that is like being able to be with ourselves no matter what. Solitude is being able to recognize maybe our shortcomings, but also what we do well, our strengths and our weaknesses. And so solitude is sort of coming and observing and sitting with that. And it's right, like that's a really important place to be when we are seeking genuine connection with others, because we need to be connected to ourselves as well. And also, if we're connecting to others, with a sort of out of whack sense of self, then those connections, it might be harder, not impossible, but just like harder to make those authentic connections. And then service. So service is so important. Volunteering your time, spending time in the service of others. It has been shown time and time over to broaden our perspective, to increase gratitude, and it provides a lot of meaning and purpose. Giving our time to something that matters to us, whether that is, I don't know, maybe it's being on the alumni board of your university. Maybe it's working with youth and adolescents. Maybe it's working or volunteering your time with elderly people who are older than you, people who might be more at risk of loneliness, or in your own sort of religious or spiritual community, right? So all of these things, while there was only one of those that was really like overtly religious or spiritual in nature, there are lots and lots of other ways to give of time to be in service to others. And it has so many positive impacts on our life. So one of those positive impacts is decreasing the likelihood, I would say, of loneliness. And then I just wanted to kind of touch on one thing that I mentioned before. We just talked about the different types of loneliness, the different signs and symptoms of loneliness, and we even talked about how to safeguard against loneliness. So now we know what to do, but what happens when we can't necessarily do those things, right? And we saw that in the case of COVID. Now that it does happen outside of COVID, so whether someone's immunocompromised, maybe they're going through chemotherapy and radiation, or have some sort of other medical related need, right, that might dictate them how many people that they can keep in their circle. Maybe as new parents, as new parents, there's a little being in the world, and they want to, in a lot of ways, it's important to keep it safe from maybe too many different sort of germs, if you will. And there's just a lot of those new days, right? Those new days, those new times as a parent, they're a lot. There might be loneliness. There's a lot that goes into being a new parent that we're not getting into, but there might be in those situations. And then we all kind of experience that with COVID. And so what do we do? What do we do in these situations? One thing that is just important to do is look for that meaningful connection on a smaller scale, right? So it may not be possible to meet physically with somebody. If it is, great, but it may not be possible. So making sure that we are constantly, that we are sort of consistently, it's probably the better C word, checking in with our people, our family, our close friends, and making sure that we're not just texting, because that isn't genuine connection, that we are having phone calls, or we're having video calls, or we're making plans to see people when we can, that we are working towards and working on genuine connection, but on a smaller scale. And then one thing that we are going to talk about next week is acceptance versus resistance. And here, I think this is the most poignant thing, the most impactful thing that I've learned, that I think that I can share, is trying to understand and work through the difference between acceptance and resistance. And I know that during these last 2 years, in the times that I've been most upset about the situation, or most sort of acutely lonely, I was resisting the situation. I was, okay, this is the situation, and now I'm gonna do everything I can, actionable, to get over it and to move past it. And I was really resisting the situation, and that caused so much struggle for me. Resistance is struggle, right? Resistance is trying to push a boulder up a hill. You know, there's this process of sitting and working towards acceptance. And so I would just say that when it's not possible for these extenuating circumstances to follow those 3 safeguards that we've learned, so genuine connection, service to others, and solitude, and that's not possible, that what might be more appropriate is going through a journey of acceptance and resistance and identifying sort of where those are at for you. We'll talk more about that next week. I just wanted to touch on and make mention of when it's not possible, when it's not possible for us to do all of those things. I hope you found some sense of identification that loneliness is needing connection, but often isolating. And so I hope that this was a moment of feeling seen and feeling connected, right? If you are feeling lonely, know that you are not alone at all. What are the small things that you can do in solitude with others and in service to others that can help you feel more connected, less isolated, and less lonely? Remember, like, subscribe, comment, share this video if you found it helpful. I look forward to seeing you again next week, and we'll talk more about acceptance and resistance. Take care.